To understand how completely and quickly this system disappeared, the picture first has to widen to just how deeply embedded coastal artillery was in American military thinking. The United States had been fortifying its harbors since before the Civil War, and by the years leading into the Second World War, the Coast Artillery Corps operated a serious, standardized network of defenses at major ports on both coasts. Congress authorized a full new construction program in September 1940, planning fresh defenses at 18 harbors, built around two standardized battery designs, a 2-gun battery of 16-inch or 12-inch guns, and a 2-gun battery of 6-inch guns, each supported by its own command posts and observation stations. Some installations that had actually been disarmed during the interwar years were hastily rearmed. After Pearl Harbor, with what troops called Panama mounts, simple circular concrete platforms that let a towed 155 meters gun be wheeled into position and traversed quickly, a stopgap built in weeks rather than years. For a brief period in early 1942, with the Pacific War just beginning and invasion fears running high on both coasts, these harbor defenses represented a genuinely serious military commitment, manned around the clock, treated as a real line of defense against a real threat. That threat, as the war progressed, never actually materialized in the form anyone had planned for. No Axis surface fleet ever approached the American mainland closely enough to test a single one of these batteries in combat. By the time Allied planners were storming beaches in Normandy and across the Pacific, it had become clear that amphibious warfare no longer required capturing a defended harbor at all. Landing craft could put troops ashore across open beaches, bypassing the entire concept. These fortifications had been built to defend against. The Coast Artillery mission, so central to American military planning for a century and a half, had been quietly overtaken by a completely different kind of war before the guns had ever fired a shot at an enemy ship. Zoom from that broad strategic shift down to the fate of a single battery, and the process of decline becomes concrete. As the war progressed, most seacoast batteries were placed on what the Army called caretaking status, guns still mounted and technically operational, but with reduced crews, limited maintenance, and diminishing practice firing. A handful of 90mm anti-aircraft batteries remained genuinely active, since air attack still seemed at least plausible, while work continued haltingly on a few new batteries that had been authorized before anyone fully grasped how irrelevant they would soon become. The older weapons, meanwhile, were already quietly being scrapped even while the war was still underway, as commanders concluded specific installations no longer justified the manpower and upkeep required to maintain them. Manning levels, harbor by harbor, kept shrinking through the final years of the war, well before Germany or Japan had formally surrendered. The formal end came in stages rather than all at once. In some regions, including the harbor defenses around Boston, the Coast Artillery Corps as a functioning organization was effectively disbanded as early as 1946. Between 1946 and 1950, the Army worked through the broader process of declaring coast defense establishments surplus, a slow bureaucratic unwinding of a system that had taken a century and a half to build. By 1949, Army planners had made the underlying decision explicit: deactivate all remaining coast artillery, and with only a handful of exceptions, scrap the big guns of the seacoast artillery outright. In 1950, the process reached its formal conclusion. Every remaining harbor defense command in the country was disbanded, and the Coast Artillery Corps was abolished as a separate branch of the Army entirely. Its last surviving units, which by that point consisted entirely of anti-aircraft artillery battalions rather than the giant seacoast guns the branch had originally been built around, were folded back into the General Field Artillery, erasing the Coast Artillery Corps as a distinct institution after 150 years of continuous existence. What made this disbandment unusually fast and complete, compared to the gradual scrapping programs facing Britain's coastal forces boats or America's own Liberty ship fleet in the same post-war years, was the total absence of any remaining rationale for the weapon system at all. Military analysts examining the decision afterward identified three separate reinforcing reasons the Coast Artillery Corps had become obsolete almost simultaneously. First, American strategic planning had shifted decisively toward projecting force far from domestic shores, relying on overseas staging bases and an unrivaled U.S. Navy to keep any future conflict away from American coastlines entirely, which made static defense of the coastline itself far less urgent than it had been in 1940. Second, because any future naval engagement was now expected to happen thousands of miles from American territory. Whatever coastal defense resources remained were judged better spent on air defense than on guns built to sink ships that would never come close enough to threaten. Third, and perhaps most decisively, the giant seacoast guns themselves were extraordinarily expensive to build, slow and difficult to emplace, and essentially immobile once installed, exactly the wrong profile for a nuclear age increasingly organized around missile technology that could be produced faster, moved more easily, and updated far more readily than a fixed concrete gun battery poured into a hillside overlooking a harbor. There was no single dramatic failure driving this collapse, no lost battle or embarrassing defeat to point to. The guns had simply become, in the space of less than a decade, weapons built to answer a threat that had quietly stopped existing while nobody was looking directly at the harbor defenses to notice. The disposal of Coast Artillery Corps property proceeded in stages, beginning with the first large-scale permanent transfer of harbor defense land away from the Army in 1947 and continuing through the mid-1950s. Some reservations, including sites along the Mississippi River, Mobile Bay, Tampa Bay, and Savannah, had actually been abandoned as active defenses decades earlier, reclaimed briefly for wartime use, and then returned again to their prior owners almost as soon as the fighting stopped. Other federal agencies got first claim on many of the remaining sites before any transfer to state or private hands, a bureaucratic process that determined which coastal forts eventually became parks, which became other military facilities, and which simply sat unused. A number of the Army's mine planter service vessels, which had laid and maintained the underwater minefields that once formed a hidden second layer of harbor defense alongside the visible guns, were transferred to the Navy and redesignated as auxiliary mine layers rather than scrapped outright, one of the few pieces of the old coast artillery system to find. Continued institutional use after 1950, analyzed as a policy decision rather than an institutional tragedy. 4 factors explain both the speed and the totality of the Coast Artillery Corps' disappearance. First, this collapse differed fundamentally from the gradual scrapping of Britain's coastal forces boats or America's own Liberty ship fleet, because there was no residual mission left to justify even partial retention. A cargo ship or small torpedo boat could always, in principle, find some reduced peacetime use. A fixed 16-inch gun built to sink an approaching battleship had almost no application once that specific threat had disappeared. Second, technological displacement, rather than simple budget pressure, drove the decision. Guided missile technology offered everything the old coast artillery could provide. Long-range, high-explosive defense of critical points with far greater flexibility, faster production, and none of the enormous upfront cost of pouring concrete emplacements into a hillside. Third, the branch's disappearance was accelerated by its own success. Because no Axis power ever seriously tested American coastal defenses, there was no combat record demonstrating continued necessity, and no dramatic near-miss to argue for retention the way genuine wartime losses sometimes preserved other obsolete systems a little longer. Fourth, institutional abolition, not just equipment retirement, marked this case as unusually complete. Britain still had a Royal Navy after scrapping its motor torpedo boats. The United States Army still had field artillery after 1950. But the Coast Artillery Corps itself, as a distinct branch with its own doctrine, culture, and 150-year institutional identity, simply ceased to exist, folded into a general artillery arm that no longer needed a specialized branch built around guarding harbors from ships. The concrete emplacements themselves proved far harder to erase than the guns they once held. Many still stand today along both American coastlines, their gun mounts empty, their observation towers crumbling, preserved more by neglect and the sheer difficulty of demolishing reinforced concrete than by any deliberate historical intention. The 16-inch guns that once stood in them, capable of throwing a shell farther than most of their crews would ever see, were melted down within months of the Corps' abolition, the physical remnants of 150 years of American coastal defense, reduced to raw steel almost as quickly as the strategic logic that built them had disappeared.